Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May is in Brussels for her first full summit of EU leaders since becoming Prime Minister. Brexit's not officially on the Council agenda because Article 50 hasn't been triggered, but that hasn't stopped it being talked about. Last night, Mrs May insisted that Britain would play a full role in all EU business until the moment we leave, while the President of the EU Council, Donald Tusk, said the other 27 EU member states would not behave like a den of lions, insisting instead that for Theresa May it would be like, quote, entering a nest of doves. Oh. The Prime Minister is due to hold talks with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, later today. I think they may have been having lunch together. By arriving at the summit, Mr Juncker seemed exasperated by questions about Theresa May.
How did the evening go with Theresa May?
We had no special event with Theresa May yesterday. She was explaining what her intentions are. I will have lunch with her, and then we'll see what has to happen.
What do you plan to say to her over lunch? What's your key message?
Are you the British Prime Minister?
I'm not the British
No,
Prime Minister,
okay.
I'm just from the BBC.
Yeah, but that makes a difference.
There you go, Mr Juncker. I shall say nothing. Let's get the latest from Brussels. Speak to our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus. We understand, Damien, that Mrs May is about to give a press conference coming up in a few minutes. We think if we get a clip of that, we will run it. Is anything really, I want to come on to a more important issue, but is anything vis-a-vis Brexit really happening over there?
To be honest, not much actually, and I think that Gallic raspberry that you heard from Jean-Claude Juncker this morning was precisely because of that actually, because I think his little frustration was that he kept being asked about what debate happened about Brexit last night, and his answer, not much, because nothing is happening until that Article 50 notification, that letter arrives here in this building. So he knew very well that last night Theresa May's intervention was only 5 minutes long at the very end of dinner, after coffee, where she stood up and simply explained a little bit about the timetable for Brexit, because it's overshadowed by the much bigger issues here about Russia, and until the UK triggers it, there won't be those negotiations. So he will have lunch with her today, and he did describe her actually. He was asked how he found her, famously her having said that he might find her difficult. He said he found her charming, but they'll be sitting down soon. There
you go. He's back in diplomatic mode again. Let's come on to the bigger issue we were talking, is in the sense of being more immediate, if I can put it that way. The British, the Germans and the French wanted to take a tougher line on sanctions against the Russians because of what's happening in Syria and elsewhere. But it was, as I understand it, effectively blocked by the Italian Prime Minister, Mr Renzi. How serious is that?
I think it's quite serious, and I think, to be honest, from my understanding, is it's not just the Italians. The Austrians have a significant part in this as well. Both of those countries have quite significant business, trading relationships with Russia. Both also have, I think, some issues politically. They want to exert themselves a little bit inside the EU in the workings. They don't want to see Germany and France dominating things. So there's a bit of that going on in the background, but it is significant because at this juncture in time, when Europeans sitting looking at what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Aleppo, and also what's been happening in Ukraine, trying to find a unified approach and still struggling a bit to find that language that they wanted to toughen up. Some of the leaders wanted it tougher, wanted explicit mention of possible sanctions, but that was toned down.
Okay, and while I've got you, Damien, Wallonia. You don't often hear me saying Wallonia on the Daily Politics, but the socialist leader of Wallonia has been holding up. He's the stop out on the EU signing its free trade deal with Canada. And I assume he's under a lot of pressure from all the leaders. In fact, I think he's been invited to join them, Wallonia being one of the regions that's part of the Belgian federal structure. Is he under a lot of pressure? Is he about to break on this? Will the deal now be done?
first question, he is, yes, under an enormous amount of pressure. I don't think he's been invited here, but he's been locked in meetings with the European Commission, with the Belgian federal government, because they need his say-so to sign that deal, to give the whole of the EU, 500 million people, the go-ahead to sign that EU-Canada trade deal. Is he about to cave? My sense is no. We were in Wallonia this week, talking to members of his Socialist Party, and they were very clear. Although they represent a small regional legislature, 3.5 million French speakers in the south of Belgium, their view, the socialist-led administration there, is that they do not like this trade deal. They do not like the fact that they believe it could undermine workers' rights, the rights of citizens in European countries, consumer rights, in favour of multinationals and big businesses. And they also do not like what they see as the protections given to multinationals, a court dispute resolution system that would sit outside European courts. They want that element of it changed. Canada's trade minister has been here locked in talks with Wallonia as well. Sounds incredible, really, when you think about it. But the Walloons sitting there today, their parliament's been meeting today, saying, no, we're not signing until we're satisfied. And I think they feel that they are sort of in the vanguard of an anti-trade feeling that is growing worldwide, and that is why they are doing so. But there are political differences, the socialists in Wallonia, the centre-right here in Brussels, and they are pressing that advantage.
Damien, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. We'll let you go to cover Theresa May's press conference now. If it happens in time, we'll run a clip of it. Damien Grammaticus there in Brussels. We're joined now by the acting director of the think tank Open Europe, Stephen Booth. Before I come on to Brexit, let's not be too myopic. Let's just look at the two other things I was talking to Damien about there. As Russia is increasingly being accused of war crimes in Syria and being on manoeuvres elsewhere, the Europeans are unable to come to a common position to turn up the sanctions screw. The EU has negotiated a free trade deal with Canada, a democratic, progressive, civilized nation, and 3 million people look like they might be able to stop it. Aren't both these things signs of a certain dysfunction in the European Union?
Well, yes, I think that's a fair comment. Yeah, I mean, on both those issues, Russia, I think that's actually where Theresa May wanted to go there in a constructive attitude and said, we can help you with some of these things.
And the French and the Germans were on the same side.
Sure, both within the European Union as we continue to be members, but also afterwards. And I think that's an important message the UK can send on when it comes to Brexit. But I think on the trade side of things, it's very concerning because at some point the UK may be in the same position as Canada, seeking that kind of trade agreement with the rest of the EU. And this sort of climate of anti-trade, anti-globalisation is certainly a difficult one with which to do these kind of deals.
But if we know that if we're to attempt to do a free trade deal to replace our membership of the single market, why do we think that in that case Wallonia or anybody else would be in the same position? Because this is to do a free trade deal that is opening out trade between the EU and Canada. Our deal, no matter how good it is, would not be as open as being in the single market. So
exactly.
Wallonia may not have a say.
That political argument certainly doesn't stand up for the reasons that you say. This is not about new opening up. It's not
if anything, it constricts.
If anything, we might be talking about putting trade barriers between the UK and the EU. So that political credibility of that argument doesn't stand up. But procedurally, it may have to go through the same process.
But though we don't know that, does it not also suggest that perhaps these multilateral trade deals are in real trouble because of anti-globalization forces, and that Wallonia would not be an issue if Britain and Canada were to do a free trade deal?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's something that, especially on the Leave side of the argument, this kind of thing would certainly seem to vindicate the decision to leave the EU, because you could say, well, actually, this is not the kind of thing we'd face in trying to, negotiate bilateral deals with the likes of Canada, but also multilaterally within the WTO. Is this something that we can start to build allies for greater free trade, because the likes of Australia, Canada, perhaps the US, depending on what happens, might see us as useful allies in that endeavour?
The meetings that are going on at the moment, and will continue until we trigger Article 50, they're just shadow dancing at the moment, aren't they?
Yes.
Posturing.
Yes, but I think what I think the UK has to try and do is shift the terms of the debate, because yes, we're having this shadow dance, but it's all around this very detailed discussion about how much trade can we get to control immigration. No one is thinking strategically about, well, what kind of relationship do we want to have between the UK and the European Union on both sides, because trade is obviously a fundamental element, but it's not the only element. And the UK is hugely important to the EU's internal security, external security. The issues about Russia, that's something the UK should want to be engaged in, and I think the rest of the EU should want the UK to be engaged. So I think at some point the UK, before we get into that formal nitty-gritty negotiation, needs to explain how we see the EU as a valuable geopolitical partner. Because I think if you set the context, some of these more knotty issues, they're going to be knotty, they're going to be difficult. But if you set them in a context, actually...
Of the broader geopolitics,
exactly, and what's the mutual,
that our soldiers are on the border of Poland.
What's the mutual interest here? And do we want to create a trade war in a situation in which we're actually dependent on each other for these much bigger issues?
We find it hard to get to grips with the British government's bargaining position. I think largely because they themselves don't yet know what their bargaining position. They're still grappling towards that. But we're even more in the dark, other than the posturing from Monsieur Hollande or Jean-Claude Juncker. We're even more in the dark as to what the EU's bargaining position is going to be, aren't we?
Yes, and that's partly because there's a high degree of sort of self-preservation, in the sense that a lot of these people face their own elections and they can't be seen to sort of give anything to the British. But I think more importantly, and I think the point I alluded to earlier, that no one is thinking in these strategic terms. And we can't expect Jean-Claude Juncker or Donald Tusk to think about that, because they deal with sort of the EU. And what we're talking about now is a broader issue about how do we manage European affairs between the EU and the UK and sort of other nations.
And that's a fair point. If you narrow it down to trade, you get the beating of breasts and the rattling of vested interests. If you place the negotiations in the context of Britain being the biggest military power in Europe, being a key part in security and intelligence, and having a major geopolitical role to play in Europe, in or out of the EU, you may then get a different result.
Well, that's why you have to go back to what David Cameron was trying to argue in his negotiation with the rest of Europe. He was saying to them, look, let's recognise that Britain plays all these other roles. It's not just about trade, it's about our global role in NATO, internal intelligence, all that kind of stuff. It's not just a trade relationship. But crucially, Cameron couldn't persuade the rest of the EU to water down freedom of movement in any way. And we can't get away from that. And you're right, Andrew, do the EU in any way want to negotiate about that, or do they just play hardball all the time?
Even though Chukwuemeka, sitting in that very seat last night on This Week, tried to argue that the Europeans were now coming round to a different view on freedom of movement. But I, as they say in Scotland, I hear my doots when it comes to Angela Merkel on that, because it's such an important part, given that she was brought up behind the Iron Curtain and so on. It's very important to her. Are we aware just how divided the British government is on this? I mean, when I first heard some of the stories, I thought it was exaggerated. But the more I've looked into it, there are huge divisions, but particularly between the three Brexiteers and between and Mr. Hammond in the Treasury, and now between Mr. Hammond and Theresa May in 10 Downing Street. I mean, they've got a lot of work to do to try and get a united front, I would suggest.
I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. There are really some serious divisions between members of the Cabinet. And one consequence of Theresa May saying, let's have some of these discussions as a cabinet group rather than taking them as sofa government, as perhaps previous governments might have done behind the doors of closed 10 Downing Street, is that we're seeing some of these tensions come out into the open, and there's been briefings and leaks and all sorts of...
They come and speak to you.
Exactly. So it's quite beneficial from trying to find out what's going on.
It's good for us.
But there are definitely divisions over the issue of immigration and some of the different systems that might be used to bring down immigration. There's a point of tension over whether you include students in the immigration figures or not.
Which Mr. Hammond seems to have been slapped down on.
He seemed to be very much hinting that he thought the public didn't consider students, foreign students, necessarily
and he might be right
as migrants.
on that.
And Number 10 has categorically ruled out budging on that. And then there's the issue of the single market. And we don't quite know where Number 10 itself stands, but Philip Hammond seems to be leading the charge as the person saying we need as full as possible access to the single market. And the three Brexiteers we know have a very different position on that.
One final question. When Article 50 is triggered, before the end of March, the Prime Minister tells us, when it's done, if it's not done at the time, then surely in the immediate aftermath, the government will come under huge pressure to give a general idea of what its negotiating position is. To not to be detailed, not to give away its tactics or all, but surely it has to lay out, this is broadly what we are going to demand in the negotiations.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I'm not of the view that that necessarily hinders its progress in the EU, because I think we actually have to start setting some parameters. What is the UK talking about? We've taken a political decision to gain political independence from the EU institutions, and they govern the space of the single market, and it governs the commercial policy of the trade. The UK is going to want an independent trade policy. And are we going to really want to intertwine ourselves so closely with the single market that we've given up the freedom that we've actually voted for? So I think the government is right to sort of set parameters at that stage. And then there's still lots of shades of grey in between that we can negotiate about. But without the parameters, A, the EU doesn't know what we're asking for. And B, Theresa May is going to find it increasingly difficult to manage the domestic politics, because it's clear that the vote has to have consequences for the relationship. And I think setting out those quite early on will also help businesses know where they stand and the public know where they stand.
All right, Steve, thank you very much. Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall at today's lunch between Mrs May and Mr Juncker?
OK, we're just going to take you straight to Brussels now as Theresa May begins to speak.
27 leaders about the UK's departure from the EU, to make clear that Britain will continue to play a full and active role inside the EU until we leave, and to also make clear that Britain will be a confident, outward-looking country, enthusiastic about cooperating with our European friends and allies after we leave. At this Council, we've talked about working together to address the root causes of mass migration, ensuring a robust European stance in the face of Russian aggression, and championing free trade around the world. And of course, the UK remains committed to trading freely with our European neighbours and cooperating with them on matters including law enforcement and counter-terrorism. Let me say a few words about the subjects we've covered over the last 2 days. The UK is leaving the EU, but we are not leaving Europe. And we are not turning our backs on our friends and allies. While we have not yet formally started the exit negotiations, here at this summit I've been clear that my aim is to cement Britain as a close partner of the EU once we have left. Yes, the United Kingdom will be a fully independent sovereign country, free to make our own decisions on a whole host of different issues, such as how we choose to control immigration. But we still want to trade freely in goods and services with Europe, and the UK will continue to face similar challenges to our European neighbours. We will continue to share the same values, and so I want a mature, cooperative relationship with our European partners. I recognise the scale of the challenge ahead. I am sure there will be difficult moments. It will require some give and take. But I firmly believe that if we approach this in a constructive spirit, as I am, then we can deliver a smooth departure and build a powerful new relationship that works both for the UK and for the countries of the EU, looking for opportunities, not problems. That is in British interests, and it is in the interests of all of our European partners too. Turning to other issues, we've also discussed what more we can do to respond to the migration crisis. From the outset, the UK has called for a comprehensive approach which addresses the root causes of migration. Here in Brussels, I reiterated the case I made at the UN for a new global approach to migration based on 3 fundamental principles: ensuring refugees claim asylum in the first safe country they reach, improving the way we distinguish between refugees and economic migrants, and recognising that all countries have the right to control their borders, and that all countries must commit to accepting the return of their own nationals when they have no right to remain elsewhere. It includes working more closely with source and transit countries, and here we've agreed to do more to help these countries prevent illegal migration and to return migrants who have no right to stay in EU countries. Alongside this, the UK will continue to provide practical support to our European partners, whether that's deploying specialist staff to Greece to help them process individual cases, or maintaining our naval presence in the Aegean and the Mediterranean. And on that subject, I can announce today that HMS Echo will take over from HMS Enterprise on operations in the central Mediterranean early next year. It was thanks to the UK that Russian action in Syria was on the agenda for this summit. I argued, along with Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande and others, for a robust and united message, calling on the Syrian regime and Russia to stop their attacks on Aleppo and making clear that the EU will consider all options if the atrocities continue. And that is what we have agreed. It is vital that we keep up the pressure on Russia to stop the assault on Aleppo and to create the space for a genuine political transition in Syria. In the meantime, we will continue to do all we can to help alleviate the horrific suffering of the Syrian people. Today in Geneva, the UK has secured an extraordinary session of the UN Human Rights Council to press for a ceasefire to enable humanitarian access to Aleppo. There are millions of innocent civilians trapped there and in other besieged locations across Syria in desperate need of food, shelter and healthcare. The UK is already the second largest bilateral humanitarian donor to this crisis, and if we can secure the access needed to Aleppo and other besieged areas, we stand ready to accelerate over £23 million of aid for the UN to distribute on the ground to help the most vulnerable in the hardest to reach parts of Syria. Finally, this morning, we have discussed trade. The UK has long been one of the strongest advocates in Europe for free trade, and we will continue to be so. Indeed, I want the UK to become more active, not less, in making the case for free trade around the world. That means that while we remain a member of the EU, the UK will continue to back the EU's free trade negotiations. And as we prepare to leave the EU, I've been clear that the UK is discussing our future trading relationship with third countries. This will not undermine the EU's trade agenda. It is not even in competition with it. We will continue to help the EU reach these important trade agreements. It is about seizing the opportunities of Brexit and about forging an ambitious and optimistic new role for Britain in the world. And as we do that, we will work to make sure that more people benefit from free trade. And through that and through our other reforms, we can build an economy and a country that works not just for the privileged few, but for everyone. Thank you. We can now take questions. Tom.
Prime Minister, I believe as we speak, 8 Russian naval warships are sailing past Dover unhindered and unencumbered on their way to Syria to potentially join and increase the slaughter and carnage. Though you have achieved something at this summit, would you like to have achieved perhaps a little bit more in terms of increasing the pressure on Russia than is in the communiqué now?
I think we had a very good discussion in relation to Russia and its actions in Syria and to the impact that we're seeing from the bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Aleppo, but obviously also the atrocities that we've seen elsewhere in Syria. We were very clear about the role of Russia and very clear about the need for the EU to give the strong statement that it has and to consider, if the atrocities, as I say, if the atrocities continue, to consider all options. And that's exactly what we will be doing. And around that table, we were all agreed on that. Further questions? Laura.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Do you really expect all 27 countries in the European Union to keep listening to Britain when we are quitting? Aren't they entitled, actually, to ignore us now? And if I may, what would you say to members of the public who are alarmed by Russian ships being in the English Channel?
Well, first, on the question that you raised about the European Union and what we're doing in relation to the European Union, how they approach us, yes, we will be leaving the European Union, but I've been clear with everybody that I've spoken to, individual leaders that I've spoken to, but also sitting around the table here in Brussels, that as long as we're members of the European Union, we will continue to meet our rights and obligations as members of the European Union. And that has been welcomed, and I think that is the right spirit and approach to take with this. Of course, the 27 will have to take discussions among themselves. I mean, we will be, as I've said, in the first quarter of next year invoking Article 50. There will be a process for the 27 to consider how they are going to conduct the negotiations. But we will continue to play our role, as I have done, sitting around the table today. I can assure you that I haven't been backwards in coming forwards on issues. And I think we're all very clear about the role that, that Russia is playing in Syria, and that's why it's so important that the EU has come up with the statement that it has today. Gary.
Thank you very much. But it is human nature, though, isn't it? If you're leaving the room, if you've got your hand on the door handle, your voice is going to be heard over these summits. There could be quite a few more of them for you, less and less. And could I also ask you, it's been signalled that Michel Barnier, the negotiator appointed by the European Commission, wants to conduct the negotiations in French. Do you consider that a gesture of good intent?
We will conduct the negotiations in the way that is going to make sure that we get the right deal for the United Kingdom. And as I sit around the table, as I've seen over the last couple of days here in Brussels, I have played my full part, and other member states want the United Kingdom to continue to play our full part for as long as we're members of the European Union. There are many issues on which we agree with people sitting around the table about the challenges that are faced in Europe and about the need for us to work together in relation to those challenges. Next question. Is there somebody from a non-UK outlet who wants to speak?
Thank you very much. Matthew Holhurst from MLS Market Insight. Prime Minister, given you say you want to make free trade...
Okay, carry on.
So, given you said you want to make free trade work for everybody in the United Kingdom, are you ready to rethink the government's position on the lesser duty rule, given that the steel industry say that reforms to this, as the Commission proposes, is essential to protect steel jobs in the UK and across Europe?
Well, what we've had a discussion about trade and about the modernisation of trade defence instruments, and what we have agreed around the table is that it is important that we look at that in a comprehensive way, that we do modernise Europe's trade defence instruments, and we look at all of those instruments, and that we do that in a balanced way, and that's what's important. It's important to balance, obviously, the interests of users, of producers, and of consumers. Anybody else? Faisal.
Prime Minister, Faisal from Sky News, do you think that the other EU leaders are getting the message? Donald Tusk said last night that it was in Britain's hands whether Article 50 was reversible or not. And in your words, you used a new formulation we haven't heard before. The UK wants to trade freely in goods and services. Is that a hint about the single market or the customs union?
No. I haven't said anything that differs at all from what we've said previously, because we've got a very clear position on this, which is that we want to have the best possible deal for trade in goods and services with and operation within the single European market. Now, as I have also said, I think we need to look at this in a new way, which is saying what we will be doing is when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, it will be having a different relationship with the EU from the relationship that it has as a member of the European Union. And so what we will be doing is negotiating that new relationship with the EU. As I say, we want the best possible deal to maximise our ability to trade with and operate within the European market, and that covers both goods and services. Who else do we have here? Francis.
Prime Minister, a domestic question, if I may. When were you first made aware of concerns about Lowell Goddard's leadership of the abuse inquiry? Who told you? What did they tell you? And what did you do about it?
Well, I set this out actually in answer that I gave in PMQs in the House of Commons earlier this week, that I was aware of tensions between the inquiry panel and the chairman. But I was also very clear that, and it is clear, that the Home Secretary cannot intervene in a public inquiry, a judge-led public inquiry, on the basis of suspicion, of rumour, or of hearsay. When the Home Office was officially made aware of issues, then the Home Office acted on those issues. And there's another important point here, Francis, which is, first of all, two important points. First of all, let's just remember why this inquiry was set up and why I set it up, which is that there are people in the United Kingdom who suffered sexual abuse as children, who for many years have been searching for justice and who have sadly had the experience that their voice has not been heard and they have not been given justice. And we owe it to victims and survivors to ensure that they can have that justice. And for many of them, they have felt over the years that people in positions of power have intervened to stop their voice from being heard. And that's why it is absolutely crucial that people in positions of power do not just intervene on the basis of hearsay and rumour. I can take one more question. As you may know, I have a lunch date that I'm that I'm going on to. One.
National broadcaster. I got a question on CETA. First of all, what's your assessment on the situation we're just facing, the Europeans and you are facing, and so concerning the Walloons? And what is your assessment then? What does it mean for the Brexit negotiations? If one single little region is actually putting everything on hold, what would this mean for the future negotiations with the UK? And what do you think about actually these 27 summits that had happening just after like last time in Bratislava in September? Thank you very much.
Well, on CETA, obviously, as you're aware, the Walloon Parliament has been looking at this particular issue. I understand that discussions are continuing and negotiations are continuing. I think that it's important that the EU is able to sign this trade deal with Canada. As you say, it's been a long time in the making, and I think it's important that it can be signed. But the discussions, as I understand it, are continuing on that particular issue. From the UK's point of view, we're not looking to replicate a model that somebody else has, that another country has. We're not looking to adopt another model that somebody else has in relation to their trade with the European Union. What we want is to develop what is a new relationship for the UK with the EU, to be there when we're outside the EU. What we want is to ensure that we have the right deal for the United Kingdom. And I think, and I'm optimistic about that. Obviously, we've got negotiations ahead of ourselves. Those negotiations will take time. As I say, there will be some difficult moments. It will need some give and take. But I'm optimistic that we can achieve the deal that is right for the UK, because I actually think the deal that's right for the UK will also be right for the European Union. Thank you.
Okay, Theresa May there finishing her address in Brussels. Mark Stone standing by, also in Brussels for us. Her ending there with saying that it's going to take a bit of give and take. She's optimistic about the future and they are leaving the EU but not leaving Europe. Very clear to say that, wasn't she?
Yes, she said it was going to be a lot of give and take. She emphasised that she hadn't been backwards in coming forwards. I'm not sure quite how that will translate as a turn of phrase into all the other languages represented here in the European Union. But it's certainly a demonstration from her that she's come in here bullish. She's come in here wanting to make quite clear that although Britain is leaving the European Union, it wants to remain a very, very close partner of Europe. That last question there was technical, but it was quite pertinent in that it's about this key trade deal that is 7 years in the making between the European Union and Canada, that has been blocked by one of the 6 regional governments here in Belgium, the Walloon government. That, so said the person asking the question, poses problems for any deal that Britain outside the European Union may want to do with the EU. If one small regional government in Belgium is able to block a massive trade deal, an important trade deal between the EU and Canada, how does that bode for any deals that may be done. Some would say that's a very, very good reason for leaving the European Union, because it is stagnated in that small regional governments can do this. Others would say it's a classic demonstration of just how hard it will be for Britain to do a deal. She says not so, because the two are very, very different. Britain is not looking to replicate a model like that between Canada and the European Union. But she did time and again emphasise that she wants a cooperative relationship. She recognises there will be challenges, give and take, as she said, and she has not been backwards in coming forwards on these issues. She was asked about some news that came in about half an hour ago. A Frenchman who's in charge of the negotiations from the European side when those negotiations start, Michel Barnier, has suggested that all the negotiations will have to be conducted in French, a very sharp departure from the status quo, which is that all negotiations, whatever they are on within the European Union, are conducted in English. It's certainly a demonstration, so would say some, of the difficulty that Europe wants to, of just how difficult Europe wants to make these negotiations, that they're suggesting that they're not going to do them in English but in French. To that, she said simply, we will conduct the negotiations in a way that is right for the UK. I was struck also by the fact that she was quite keen to get questions from other broadcasters and other journalists from countries other than the UK. They're up there in that press room now. There are many people in there. Obviously, it's the Brits that ask the first questions, but she wants to be amplified on the other news channels of the other countries as well. This is very much a European issue. And she finally made the point that she's got a lunch date. That is with Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission. Don't forget, she's met Martin Schulz, the President of the Parliament, already in London. She's met Donald Tusk, the President of the Council. The Commission President, perhaps the most important, she will be meeting him, as I say, right about now. One last point to make, this whole idea of how you can have free trade, be part of the common market, and yet restrict freedom of movement of people. Well, she'll be reminded of something that Martin Schulz said yesterday, which is the EU will not accept a Europe where lorries and hedge funds are free to cross borders, but citizens are not. That's the conundrum. That's at the heart of these negotiations, which of course are yet to start.
OK, Mark, thanks very much.
Well, let's turn to not an unrelated story. Downing Street has rejected suggestions that the border between the UK and France be moved from Calais to Kent. Well, the suggestion was made by the French presidential favourite, Alain Juppé. Well, joining us now via Skype from Paris is the journalist Peter Allen, and from central London, The Spectator's associate editor, Toby Young. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here. Peter, I wonder if we can start with you. Can we try and dig down into exactly what Alain Juppé is trying to achieve here? I mean, as things stand, he looks likely to be the next president.
He does. He looks very likely to be the next president. He's really putting forward a very, very sensible idea, which is that it's in nobody's interest to continue to have thousands of refugees sitting in a very muddy field in Calais and who have no hope of having their cases heard in Britain. They want to go to Britain, they want to claim asylum. He's suggesting that that should be the case, should be allowed to go and do that. And it's very likely, again, he'll be president next year, and that's what will happen.
Toby, Peter's arguing that it's in no one's interest to keep thousands of people in those camps in the north of France. I imagine that there are politicians on this side of the English Channel that would disagree with that.
I think it's in the interests of both the British and the French governments to maintain the juxtaposed border controls. It's transparently in the interests of Britain, because if we made it easier for migrants to cross, illegal immigrants and asylum seekers to cross from France to the UK, then we'd have many, many more trying to get to the UK to claim asylum than we have at present. And also, we'd have something like the jungle camp in Kent rather than Calais, and that certainly wouldn't be popular with the people of Kent. I think it's in the interests of the French government, because the juxtaposed border controls enable the flow of tourism and commerce between our two countries to take place relatively easily and efficiently. That would certainly be impeded if you reimposed national border controls on the right sides of the Channel. I mean, if you can imagine the Channel Tunnel, a train, if people getting onto the Eurostar weren't properly scrutinised because you no longer had UK border folk on the French side, then you'd get people arriving in the UK who weren't entitled to be in the UK, trying to claim asylum as soon as they got off the train, and that would create unbelievable delays. So it's not in the French government's interest, particularly as it owns a 50% stake in the Eurostar. But finally, given how many more migrants, illegal immigrants, asylum seekers would seek to come to the UK if the juxtaposed border controls were done away with, you get many more ending up in French ports like Calais, waiting to try and make the crossing across the channel. So it's not in the French government's interest, and it's certainly not in the British government's interest.
Peter, the question then becomes, I mean, how exactly can the French government, if Alain Juppé is successful and becomes president, how can they compel the British to sit back down at the negotiating table? The agreement has been signed, and certainly the noises from Number 10 certainly aren't conducive to open discussion on the matter.
I think there's a very simple point that Toby didn't cover there, and that is the whole question of processing. He's talking about people travelling across the channel. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody knows what their background is. Nobody really knows what they want in many cases. The whole point is that, for example, next week, the jungle camp looks as though it's going to be raised. They're going to carry out this absolute farce of putting all these immigrants in villages and towns all over France, dispersing them, pretending that they can process them there. They can't, because most of these people do not want to claim asylum in France. That's the whole issue. And the issue is, if they can be transferred to Britain in a sensible manner, they can be processed, in which case they would be the type of people who are travelling over, and it wouldn't just be people who are desperately trying to get into the black market or hang about doing nothing, and they're certainly not the kind of people who want to sit around in a field in Kent as opposed to sitting about in a field in Calais.
Toby, if we looked, for example, at the House of Commons this morning, that urgent question brought by Philip Davis, he's not alone. There are a number of MPs and significant serious figures who are questioning whether or not we can process these people, even if they're over the age of 18, whether or not we can be sure that they're coming to the United Kingdom for the purposes that Peter says they are.
Well, I think it would be very difficult. I mean, we've seen with the attempt to try and process the children over the past week or so, just how lacking in capacity the Home Office and Immigration Service is. So the notion that they could absorb far greater numbers of arrivals and asylum applicants, I think, is silly. But I think, you know, just because the people that are in the jungle and elsewhere in France want to come to the UK doesn't make them our responsibility. If they're asylum seekers, the Dublin regulation stipulates that they're obliged to seek asylum in the first safe European country they arrive in. So if they arrive in Greece or if they arrive in Austria, then the Dublin regulation stipulates that that's where they should seek asylum. They shouldn't wait until they can get to the UK to seek asylum here. And if they're illegal immigrants and not legitimate asylum seekers, then surely the French government is responsible, because it's the French government who've allowed them to enter France by not guarding its own borders properly. That's not the British government's problem. That's a problem for the French government.
Peter, how have French politicians, because let's be fair, I mean, Juppé is not the first person to propose this, how have French politicians got round that point, that the migrants, whatever you want, the refugees, whatever you want to call them, are in France, and they need to seek asylum before they get on a boat, get on some form of transport to get to the United Kingdom?
Well, again, we go back to the same point. These are people who want to claim asylum in Britain. They don't want to stay in France. They don't want to stay in Belgium. They don't want to stay in Italy. Dare I say, it's rather silly and naive to suggest that people are able to process people who don't want to stay with them. I mean, it's just absolutely farcical idea. The whole point is we have to be logical about this and say that if somebody wants to try and claim asylum in Britain, perhaps they have family in Britain, perhaps they speak English, perhaps they have cultural links with Britain. There are all kinds of reasons why people want to go to Britain. Surely they should have this chance to go there, to be processed. If that process fails, deport them, send them away. that's fine. But come on, you can't just argue that we can sort them all out when they arrive in Italy, leave Italy to sort it all out, Belgium to sort it out, and poor old France to have to become the policeman of the developing world, or people from war-torn countries. They have to sort them all out and force them to stay here. It's an absolutely absurd idea.
But, Peter, the problem with what you're suggesting is that if you make it easier for refugees to seek asylum status in the UK, you're going to attract many, many more refugees than we have at present. And there is no political appetite in the UK to absorb a greater number of refugees than we're absorbing at present. We just had an EU referendum in this country, and one of the big issues in that referendum is that we wanted more control of our borders and we wanted to be able to control immigration. So to suggest what you're suggesting, which would result in far greater numbers of refugees trying to claim asylum in the UK, would be politically just absolutely disastrous.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Peter Allen, Toby Young, thanks both for joining us here on Sky News.
Now, it was 1 o'clock in the morning before Theresa May got her chance to update European Union leaders on her plans for Brexit at their summit in Brussels. It took her 5 minutes and there were no responses from the assembled presidents and prime ministers. Today, the Prime Minister insisted that Britain would continue to play a full role in the EU right up until the moment that we leave. From Brussels, our political editor Gary Gibbon reports.
Hugs and high fives around the table today, for some anyway. Last night, Theresa May was given the less than prestigious 1 in the morning slot to say her bit about Brexit. Perhaps sensing tiredness and fidgeting in the room, Theresa May spoke for only 5 minutes. No one responded, and the meeting broke up. This morning, the President of the European Commission indicated it hadn't been an important part of the proceedings here.
How did the evening go with Theresa May?
Late last night, Germany's Chancellor Merkel said the Brexit negotiations promised to be rough. Earlier, President Hollande had said they would be hard. And just before Theresa May's end-of-summit press conference, it was reported that the European Commission's Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, wanted those Brexit talks to be conducted in French. Do you consider that a gesture of good intent?
We will conduct the negotiations in the way that is going to make sure that we get the right deal for the United Kingdom.
Many here aren't thrilled with Mrs May's message that Britain wants to be treated like any other full member right up until it leaves the EU. One leading MEP said it angered many that Britain was trying to stop some EU plans. It is human nature, though, isn't it? If you're leaving the room, if you've got your hand on the door handle, your voice is going to be heard over these summits. There could be quite a few more of them for you, less and less.
As I sit around the table, as I've seen over the last couple of days here in Brussels, I have played my full part, and other member states want the United Kingdom to continue to play our full part for as long as we're members of the European Union.
The meeting ended with a classic EU fudge on whether the EU would mount sanctions against Russia over its actions in Syria. No certainty, too, on whether there will be an EU-Canada trade deal. Theresa May tried to reassure leaders here that Britain doesn't think it can have its cake and eat it in the negotiations on Brexit. She acknowledged there would be give and take. This afternoon, Theresa May held her first one-on-one conversation with Jean-Claude Juncker. Number 10 acknowledged she'd now given up on attempts to get the EU to do some pre-negotiating before Britain formally applies to leave. Here, they think that's one victory in the many battles to come, chalked up to the 27 staying put. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Brussels.
I've been getting